I really appreciate Mike leading that last song, There's a Rainbow in the Cloud. But how many times is it that the only thing we see are the clouds? When the winter's here and storms, harvest grain's going to come. Somewhere there's a blessing. I want to think about that just a little bit this morning. Look for the blessing. You know, when everything is going smooth for us, it's easy to count the blessings one by one, isn't it? But when things become a little adverse, when the storm winds blow against us, it's a little harder to remind ourselves to focus on the blessings. Life is filled with ups and downs. That is just the nature of the way life under the sun is. It's never a steady climb. It's always up and it's always down. So we have to train ourselves. We have to train ourselves to look for the blessing in things. I'm reminded of Moses. After the 40 years of leading the children of Israel through the wilderness, he comes right down to the dead-end time before God is going to lead them across the Jordan. And Moses has had a hard time during these years because of the fretfulness and the pettiness and the discouragement that the people constantly brought to his doorstep. And on that last occasion, when he was supposed to speak to the rock, he decided to strike the rock. You just want to jump in the text and say, Moses, whoa, stop midstream. As you've got your hand raised, whoa, stop right there. Think about what you're doing. But in that impetuous moment, he struck the rock. And God told him, and these words have always amazed me, because you believe me not, you will not be allowed to enter and lead the children of Israel across the promised land. Those very words were uttered 40 years before, recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 1, when the children of Israel believed the 10 spies and said because of unbelief, he was going to turn them back. And now in this moment, God says, because you believe me not. Does it not seem like that's about as dark as the clouds can get? But there was still a blessing for Moses. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 4, God showed him the promised land. He did not get to lead across to the promised land, but God allowed him to see the promised land. And even with that monumental moment in Deuteronomy chapter 34 that is recorded that sees the promised land, when God restrains him from going, still, in Hebrews chapter 11, we have the name of Moses in that abbreviated section of his life that's recorded. So in spite of that one moment, he is still identified as a man of faith. And the blessing was he still was able to see the promised land. What an amazing, amazing experience that must have been for him. From the throes of disappointment to the exultation of being able to see the land that finally they've dreamed of and will be a reality. I want you to think about 3 or 4 things with me this morning about noticing the blessing. First of all, when we think about this idea of the blessing, we need to see that blessings are everywhere. If you turn to Philippians chapter 1, Philippians chapter 1, I want you to see how Paul saw the blessing in things. I know that you are familiar with what's taking place here in this section. I know you're familiar with the fact that Paul is in prison. Things are blowing against him. And in spite of being in prison, there are still some things that people are trying to do to hurt him. But notice beginning in verse 12. I want you to know, brethren, that the things which have happened to me actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Just pause there a moment. If that was all we had. The things that have happened to me have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. When the turmoil is there, when the winds are blowing in our face, when adversity is our companion along the way, do we stop to think that the things that have happened to us could possibly have been for the furtherance of the gospel? But in spite of being in prison, that's what he says. And then he continues. So that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. Second thing, he is chained 24 hours a day to the Praetorian guards. And people are coming and going, visiting him. And as they're coming and going, he is telling the wonderful story of love. And these old barbaric Praetorian guards are getting to see the spirit of this man, and they're getting to hear the story firsthand from him. And so whatever's happening is for the furtherance of the gospel. And then he continues. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Another blessing. Paul is in prison. And yet, how do the brethren respond to that? They have become more confident. They're not running and hiding. They become more confident to tell the story and to do so without fear. I'm reminded of the story when Paul is in his last imprisonment. That it records about Onesiphorus. That says, he has sought me out and it oft refreshed me. Onesiphorus is stationed in Ephesus. Paul's in prison in Rome. That's not just around the corner. Onesiphorus sought him out and refreshed him. So here, even in prison for the last time, understanding that he's about to have his life taken, there's someone that comes to show him a rainbow in the cloud. But back to Philippians 1, verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ, even for envy and strife. Some also for goodwill. It's not just enough that Paul's in prison. Now there are those who are trying to poke it in his eye. He said they're preaching for envy and strife. But notice the attitude of Paul. I wonder, how would we respond? How would I respond to that? If I knew that Jordan and Noah were preaching out of envy and spite just to get me, how would I respond to that? Would I say like Paul, but I thank God the gospel is being preached? And he said, the former preached Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Could the circumstances have been much more challenging for this man? And yet his concluding statement in this section is, I'll rejoice, and yes, always rejoice. Look at Philippians 4 just a moment. Philippians chapter 4. Look at verse 10. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. That now at this last hour, your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I'm in to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. In my opening remarks, I said we have to train ourselves. Was Paul kind of a super apostle? Was Paul kind of a Superman? No, he said, I have learned in whatever condition I'm in, I've learned to be content. I've learned in whatever condition I'm in, I've learned to find the blessing. If I'm hungry or if I'm filled, I have learned to find the blessing. What about us? Have we learned to find that blessing? Have we learned to look for that blessing? Do we often pray the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak? Is it that sometimes I don't see the blessing because I don't feel like I belong? Is it that sometimes I don't see the blessing because things didn't go according to the way I think they ought to go? Is it that sometimes I don't see the blessing because all I can see is the person reflected in the mirror? And when I see the person reflected in the mirror, all I see are the curses. Paul learned to see the blessing. Turn to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. There are several seminal points, seminal circumstances in the life of Peter. But this circumstance has always kind of stood out to me. Maybe there's another one you would choose. But notice as it begins in verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples to get in the boat and go before him to the other side. And go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come. Command me to walk on the water." And he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. and began to sink and cried out, saying, Lord, save me. Is the only thing we ever see in that story is that Peter took his eyes off the Lord, he began to sink. Well, that's all we ever see in that story. We miss the blessing that Peter experienced. The apostles are in the boat. I think there were 12. And there was one that said, Lord, command me to walk on the water. And Peter got out and he walked on the water. He did something the other 11 did not do. He just didn't get out of the boat. He got out of the boat and walked on water. Yeah, but look at it. When he saw the wind, how do you see the wind? He saw the effects of the wind. He saw everything boiling around him and boisterous. And when he did, he took his eyes off the Lord and began to sink. And what we look at is that last part. Jesus said, oh, ye of little faith. See, Peter, you lost your faith. But he still had the faith to say, Lord, save me. And once again, he experienced something the others didn't experience. He experienced the outreach hand of the Lord, or however he did that, whatever medium he used. He experienced the outreach hand of the Lord grabbing Peter and pulling him up. It's not just that Peter walked on water. He cried to the Lord, save me, and the Lord did not say, you perish. The Lord saved him. And he experienced the power of his saving hand, raising him out of that water from which he was doomed. And did you notice what the word of the Lord was to Peter? He spoke this to Peter. Do not be afraid. Those in the boat didn't get that. Their risk averseness did not put them in a position where they were going to possibly fail. And we look at Peter, we kind of throw this in his face, that look at what Peter did and how he failed. He didn't keep his faith. Wait. Even though he began to sink, there were some blessings that Peter experienced that none of the rest of them got to see. Do you think that when the grandchildren are huddled around Peter at night and he's telling the stories of his experience with Jesus, he says, let me tell you about this. But Matthew's not telling that. Bartholomew's not telling that. Thaddeus is not telling that. Andrew's not telling that. Peter said it was the most amazing thing. I asked him, please let me walk on water. And he commanded me to do so. And in that moment that I took my eye off of him, I began to sink, and I cried out to him, and he saved me and said, don't be afraid. Let me tell you something, children. My grandchildren, let me tell you something. You may take a risk sometime. There may be something you are bold enough to cry to the Lord, please let me do, and you do it. And the next thing you know, you have taken your eye off of him, but you cry, save me, and you will experience a salvation that those who stay in the boat never experience. Peter saw the blessing. Do we? Do we see the blessing in our circumstances? Whatever the circumstances are in our life, maybe they're not what we dreamed of being. Maybe there are things that have happened in my life that have not gone according to the way I laid them out when I was laying my life out. But can you still see the blessings? Can you still see the Lord is there to help save you? And he's still there to say those words that Peter heard. Be not afraid. it is in our face that this world is in chaos. Should we be so surprised? But even in a world of chaos, listen, there are still blessings that the Lord is giving us and showering upon us. Do we see the blessings? Another thing I want you to think about with me is it wasn't just Peter and Paul that saw the blessings. There were churches that saw the blessings too. I think about the church at Corinth. I think about Corinth itself. It is the zenith, the capital, the epitome, whatever adjective you want to use to describe the height of immorality and ungodliness. In fact, when Paul's there, he says, Lord, you made a mistake putting me here. And the Lord says to Paul, no, I've got many people there. Out of this quagmire, out of this hellish pit of putridity, you've got many people here. And sure enough, there are some of those people there that were in fornication, they were drunkards, they were murderers, they were revilers, they were effeminate, they were liars, they were murderers. And then he says, that's what you were, but you've been washed, you've been clean, you've been sanctified, you've been justified. Wait a minute. Out of this quagmire of humanity, of sin, here are some people. Here are some people that hear the gospel Paul preaches, and they're saved, and they're added to the Lord. And they form that collective there called the Church of God at Corinth. And yet, they haven't left all that behind because they're having a problem with preacheritis. Some of them are hooked on Paul, some on Cephas, some on Apollos. And Paul said, whoa, wait a minute. We didn't die for you. There's one that died for you. He laid a foundation we build upon. It's not us. But what they're doing is they're looking to their teachers and not looking to the Lord. And then the next thing you know, there's something taking place in that church that they've not mourned about. In fact, they're rather puffed up about it, that is not even named. Not even the Gentiles practice this. I mean, how much more putrid can you get than you're doing something in this church and it's accepted in the church that the world doesn't even tolerate around you? Whatever it means, there's a man there that is committing immorality with his father's wife. And then they've got a big fuss going on among them that they can't settle themselves. They can't even find a wise man to do it. But turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. In the midst of all that, in this second letter, I can't help but think that Paul is somewhat downcast. In fact, I know he's discouraged. I know he's really concerned about how the Corinthians have received his first letter until Titus comes. And then he just takes a big sigh of relief because they've received it and they've responded well. And he's telling Titus all along, these are good people. These are good people. These are good people. These are good people. Everybody that will listen to him about Corinth, this is a good church. These are good people. And so in verse 13, he says, therefore, we've been comforted in your comfort, and we rejoiced exceedingly more the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. For if anything I have boasted to him about you, I am not ashamed. But as we spoke all things to you in truth, even so our boasting to Titus was found true. Here are these people who seem to have been influenced by the Judaizers that are coming in, and all they want is the money in their pocket. They don't want their heart. And Paul said, all I wanted was your heart. I didn't want your money. I robbed other churches, taking wages of them, so that did not take place. So you didn't think I was here to stick my hand in your pocket? You have to walk away with Paul, wondering whether your billfold's still in your back pocket. But with these Judaizers, you had to check. And lo and behold, they're telling people, you know, when Paul stands before you, he's one way, but when he's behind the keyboard, he's another way. You know, he's writing that letter on that keyboard. He's hammering it out on the keyboard there, and he's putting it out on the screen, and he proofreads that. Man, I'm telling you, he is salty, but when he comes before you, he's cowardly. And in spite of all that, in spite of how heartbroken he was, he says in the 3rd chapter, you are my letters known and read among men. And still you're doing this. But he says, in spite of all that, I boasted about you. I bragged about you. I often wonder how comfortable I would have been. I wonder how comfortable any of us would have been being a member of the church at Corinth, knowing what was going on at the church at Corinth. But in spite of all that, that church was a blessing to Paul. In Revelation, in the book of Revelation, you have the story of the 7 churches. You have the story of the 7 churches, and you come down to Smyrna in chapter 8. Verse 8 of chapter 2. And it doesn't seem like things can get much worse here. He says, I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you're rich. I know the blasphemy of those who say they're Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Here's a church that is described as a synagogue of Satan. Here's a church that has in its assembly the presence of Satan, and the presence of Satan is so pervasive there. It is called a synagogue of Satan. The lampstand hasn't been removed yet. The Lord's telling them, the lampstand is in jeopardy. I'm about to remove the lampstand. But he says then, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful in the dying. And I will give you a crown of life. Whoa. There are going to be some in that congregation described as a synagogue of Satan who are still going to be called faithful. Would we still be a member there? Will we still be attending there? Will we still be numbered among the saints at Smyrna, knowing the synagogue of Satan is there? Would we be among those who would be described as faithful to receive the crown of life? In spite of the fact the synagogue of Satan was there, there's some, here's the blessing, that are going to receive a crown of life. It doesn't get any better when you go to Pergamos. Because when you go to Pergamos, it says in the latter part of verse 13, he says, Antipas, my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, notice, where Satan dwells. That word dwells is rules. Here's where Satan rules. And notice what's happening. I have a few things against you because there are those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, to commit sexual immorality. Thus you have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Here's a church where immorality is taught. It's not just practiced, it's taught. And there's some sort of Gnostic thought and philosophy that's working its tentacles into the group there and being accepted. Is there a blessing in that church? Yes. There was one named Antipas who was my faithful martyr. And I ask again, would we still be with that church? Turn to chapter 3. And you come to Sardis. And Sardis is described as a church that has a name but that's dead. This church is graveyard dead. They have a sign out front that says Church of Christ. But they are graveyard dead. But notice what he says in verse 4. But you have a few names, even in Sardis, who've not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. In spite of the fact this is a dead church, there are some individuals in that church that have not died and that are still very much alive, who have not stained their garments. In a dead church, there can even be blessings. In a dead church, there can still be individuals. Though the church may be described overall as dead, as a collective, there are some individuals there who have not stained their garments. They're still white. There are still some people there that are alive. And because of that, he had not removed their candlestick. You see the blessing that's there? Here's a church with a synagogue of Satan, one where Satan rules on the throne, and here's a church that is dead. And in every one of those, there's a church that's a blessing, where a blessing is present. So I want to ask, do we see the blessings in this church? Do we see the blessings in this church? Do we stop and see the blessings in this church? Is there anyone in this church that has life all figured out? Are the men you've asked to be elders, shepherds, bishops perfect? Do you always agree with their judgment? What might be fascinating for you to know is that we don't always agree with each other's judgment. Do we form conclusions about one another and we haven't taken the time to talk to one another? Will I tell others about the fault of another, or my gripe about something, but I won't go tell the person I've got the gripe against, or the person that I need to address it to? How many times will I go tell somebody? How many times will I go tell somebody else? That person will go tell somebody else. Someone comes to elders and said, they said, some said. Wait a minute, who's the they? Who are the some? Do we not realize when we say they said, some said, and we don't tell who said, what they said, we indict the whole group, and now the whole group becomes suspicious? And in spite of going there, can we not just stop that and see the blessing that we have here? That we have a group of people historically who have always pulled together. Whether it's been financial or what other way there is, they've always provided for one another. That there are a group of elder, shepherd, bishops who watch over us, who try to provide for us. That we have deacons who try to make this machine work in a well-oiled way behind the scenes. And that we have Christians here who teach and Bible classes that are tremendous. And people who love the Word of God. Can we not see the blessings that are there? Will we stop and just see the blessings? When they came up to the river, and the 12 spies came back, and the 10 said, we are not able. There were 2 men who stood and saw the blessings because they believed what God said we are able. God has given us the land. And because 2 men out of 12 had the insight to see the rainbow in the cloud, they crossed over, and the promise of the Messiah was preserved. And Joshua leads them, just as Moses would have. When we look at that story in Luke chapter 15, that third of the 3 parables that's there, and we think about that first boy that's there, the lesson really is about the second boy, but the first boy gets to the second boy. But the point about the first boy is he takes all that he has and he spends it and wastes it. We call him a prodigal. And he's so hungry he'll eat what pigs eat. And then finally he comes to himself. But the only thing we see in that boy is, look at how he wasted his life. Listen. If you've ever had a child that wandered away and came back to the father, you know how that father felt. And that father understood the blessing of that son coming home. Yes, we live in the midst of sin, sickness, death. And there are things that happen in life under the sun that sometimes are catastrophic for us. Sometimes they have lifelong effects. They're not things we would have chosen. And it may well be that in this life, that is the course that we travel. And that there may be no break. But does that mean there's no blessing? Because life in the Son will help us see all the pain, regret, and sorrow that life under the sun will seem as nothing. Will seem as nothing. When we think about the healer this year, let's please stop and think about our blessings. Let's capitalize on the blessings and minimize the complaints and the disgruntlement. Because really, the blessings are greater than the complaints. I just want to ask you, find the blessing. Find the blessing. We're going to have a word of prayer, and then Mike will lead us in one verse of song. Thank you.